This is the map that Vladimir Putin stared at on April 9, 2026, prepared by Russia's Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, and handed directly to the man who controls the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It showed villages captured, territory secured, the war progressing precisely according to plan. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. Almost none of it was real. The villages marked on that map were not under Russian control. The advances it depicted had not happened. Gerasimov looked at the most powerful man in Russia, pointed to fabricated lines drawn across Ukrainian territory, and said with complete authority that everything was going according to plan. Make no mistake, this is not a minor intelligence failure. This is the single most dangerous dynamic that can develop inside a nuclear-armed state actively at war. The complete disconnection of the man at the top from the reality his forces are experiencing on the ground. And the architects of that fiction are not his enemies. They are his generals. Let's get technical about this for a moment, because the numbers here are not just extraordinary. They are the mathematical fingerprint of a command structure in terminal collapse. The leaked Russian Ministry of Defense map, authenticated by open-source intelligence organizations and published May 28, 2026, claimed Russian forces had fully captured Primorske, Rychne, Veselyanka, Zapasne, Mali Sherbaki, and Sherbaki in Zaporizhia Oblast, plus the southwestern approaches to Orikhiv up to the railway line, and Novodanilivka, Malotokmachka, and Bilohirya. The Institute for the Study of War, cross-referencing satellite imagery and confirmed unit positions, found zero evidence of Russian forces entering Orikhiv, Rychne, or Veselyanka. The closest Russian troops had come to Orikhiv was 3 kilometers, not into the city, not at its limits, toward it. In multiple cases, Russian forces had not approached the marked settlements at all. The map handed to the President of the Russian Federation was not an optimistic interpretation of ambiguous battlefield data. It was a fabrication, drawn with deliberate intent to deceive, by Russia's most senior military officer, about Russia's most consequential ongoing operation. Let that sit for a moment. From January through May 26, 2025, Russian forces captured 1,619 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That same period in 2026 yielded 104 square kilometers, a 93.5% collapse in offensive capacity in a single year. 104 square kilometers across nearly 5 months of fighting, with hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of artillery systems, and a defense budget consuming over 40% of Russia's total federal spending. That is the sum total of Russian military gains across the entire Eastern Front through spring 2026. And Gerasimov, who understands precisely what that number signals about the war's trajectory, produced a map showing the opposite. Here is the part the mainstream news missed entirely. Gerasimov is not lying because intelligence systems failed him. He is lying because honesty is structurally impossible inside Vladimir Putin's command architecture. The officer who delivers catastrophic news does not retain his position. The officer who admits year-over-year offensive progress, collapsed 93.5%, does not go home the same man he left as. So the generals built an entire apparatus of manufactured optimism, not because they are incompetent, but because the system punishes accuracy and rewards flattering fiction. The map is not Gerasimov's personal moral failure. The map is what happens when an authoritarian power structure that punishes honest messengers gets a war it cannot win. On the same nights Gerasimov's fabricated map was being exposed, Ukraine was systematically dismantling the military infrastructure that map was designed to protect the fiction of. On the night of May 28 to 29, 2026, Ukrainian forces executed a coordinated multi-vector precision campaign across occupied territory that Russian command was entirely unprepared for, because the commanders responsible had been telling Putin for months that everything was under control. In Feodosia, on occupied Crimea's eastern coast, Ukrainian forces destroyed an ST-68 radar installation, NATO designation Tin Shield. This system was the structural backbone of the Russian integrated air defense network across the peninsula's eastern sectors, tracking low and medium altitude threats, relaying targeting coordinates to S-300 and S-400 batteries across Crimea's entire defensive perimeter. Days earlier, Ukraine had already destroyed the 5N63S mobile command and illumination radar, the guidance brain of those same complexes. Two sequential strikes, two layered components of Russia's electronic vision over Crimea, permanently removed. In Donbass, simultaneously, Ukrainian forces destroyed drone ground control stations near Kalinove and Novohrodivka, ammunition depots near Mariupol and Buhas, and a primary munitions storage site near Hrabove. A tactical command center near Paraskovivka was destroyed 3 days prior, killing 18 officers and personnel. Make no mistake, Ukraine is not conducting opportunistic raids. Ukraine is executing a sequenced air defense suppression and logistics interdiction campaign, opening aerial corridors over Crimea that Storm Shadow cruise missiles will fly through with dramatically higher success rates than Russia's degraded radar network can now track. Stay with me, because this goes all the way back to the structural mechanism that destroyed the last great Russian military machine, and is destroying this one through identical internal logic. In the final decade of the Soviet Union, commanders across every branch developed reporting architectures designed to tell Moscow what Moscow needed to hear. Equipment readiness was reported at 90% when operational reality sat near 55%. Territorial control was systematically overstated. The men at the top made resource allocation decisions based on those reports, and the compounding effect across years built a military machine that appeared operational on every paper assessment and was hollow in every practical engagement. When the autopsy came, one central finding dominated: an information architecture engineered not to inform power, but to protect information bearers from the consequences of honest delivery. The 2026 version runs on the same institutional code, inside the same organizational culture, with one critical difference. The gap between the fiction and the reality is wider than anything the Soviet military sustained at a comparable stage of institutional pressure. A 93.5% collapse in annual offensive progress cannot be absorbed by any map, regardless of how many fictional villages are drawn onto it. And the resources required to paper over a gap that wide are accelerating the collapse they were designed to conceal. Let's get technical about the financial architecture collapsing in parallel, because the fake maps and the disintegrating ruble are the same story told by different instruments. Russia's federal budget deficit reached 5.9 trillion rubles, approximately $80 billion, in just the first 4 months of 2026. The full-year parliamentary target was 3.8 trillion rubles. Russia burned through its entire projected annual deficit before May arrived. GDP contracted 0.3% in the first quarter, the first economic contraction in 3 years, officially placing the economy on a recessionary trajectory. Real inflation in food and services is running double digits against a government target of 5%. And into this exact environment, the State Duma on May 28 passed a law that no sovereign nation in the modern era has needed to pass. It authorized bank employees to shoot down drones, not soldiers, not air defense specialists, tellers and security guards at Sberbank, at the central bank, at the Russian Cash Collection Association, are now legally permitted to deploy electronic warfare jamming systems and physically engage enemy unmanned aerial vehicles over their facilities. The official justification was operational necessity. Russia's military air defense is so overwhelmed protecting Moscow and strategic military sites that the country's entire financial sector is undefended against Ukrainian strike drones. Let that sit for a moment. The nation with the world's largest nuclear arsenal has legislatively transferred territorial air defense to its commercial banking sector and told those institutions to fund the capability themselves because the state cannot cover the cost. Here is the part the mainstream news missed entirely. This is not a creative security policy. This is the state's monopoly on violence. The definitional line between a functioning government and a failed one being quietly, legislatively, contracted out to private institutions because the state can no longer perform it internally. Alexander Shokin, Russia's most powerful business lobby chairman and Putin's personally appointed business ombudsman, told Putin directly on May 26 that private companies were prepared to purchase heavy anti-drone equipment and electronic systems, but could not find qualified operators anywhere in the civilian market. The practical consequences are not abstract. Bank employees discharging weapons or operating heavy jamming equipment across Moscow's commercial districts will interfere with civilian aviation frequencies, generate urban chaos, and produce inevitable friendly fire incidents. More structurally, forcing private companies to build their own independent armed paramilitary security operations is one of the most consistently documented early indicators of state fragmentation, the institutional condition that precedes warlordism in every documented case of great power collapse. Vladimir Putin spent 25 years projecting that Russia's internal security architecture is unified under absolute central command. One law signed May 28, 2026, contradicts that image with binding legal text. Make no mistake, what Judge Vera Fokeyeva signed in the Kamovniki District Court on May 28 is not the conclusion of a corruption investigation. It is the Kremlin consuming its own private economy to pay its war bills. The court ordered transfer of shares held by Vadim Moshkovich, Forbes listed at approximately $2.9 billion net worth, along with shares of former CEO Maxim Basov, nephew Sergei Tribunsky, wife Natalia Bikovskaya, and Tribunsky's wife Luisa Ploshchanskaya to state control through RSHB Finance LLC, a subsidiary of the Russian Agricultural Bank. Total shares transferred, approximately 958 million, representing more than 65% of the company. The court simultaneously confiscated 10.5 billion rubles in cash, plus millions in dollars, euros, and yuan held in associated accounts. Rusagro manages 826,000 hectares across 15 Russian regions, operates dozens of sugar, oil, and meat processing facilities, and generated 396.5 billion rubles in revenue in 2025. This is Russia's domestic food security infrastructure, absorbed overnight by the state, not because provable crimes were independently established, but because the federal deficit hit 5.9 trillion rubles before spring ended, and the government requires assets it cannot generate through legitimate economic activity. The oligarch class that sustained Putin's system for 25 years in exchange for property rights is now receiving the definitive answer to what those rights were always worth, exactly as much as the state needs them to be, and not 1 ruble more. On the same night, a Russian drone violated Romanian airspace, struck an apartment building in the city of Galati, and wounded 2 civilians on NATO soil. Romania scrambled 2 F-16 fighters and filed an emergency report directly to NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, formally requesting immediate anti-drone system deployment to its territory. The Kremlin's complete official response. Dmitry Peskov confirmed that Putin had been informed. Simultaneously, State Duma Speaker Volodin threatened Elon Musk and SpaceX directly, warning that continued Starlink provision to Ukrainian forces could trigger Russian retaliation using weapons that leave no trace, an unambiguous reference to orbital nuclear detonation generating an electromagnetic pulse capable of disabling satellite infrastructure across entire continental regions. This threat emerged because Ukrainian Defense Minister Fedorov coordinated with SpaceX to disable unauthorized Starlink terminals Russian forces were using for frontline drone coordination, directly enabling Ukraine to recapture 400 square kilometers within weeks. Russia loses the technology contest, loses the territory, cannot answer either loss through conventional military capability. And Moscow's legislature threatens to detonate something in orbit that would disable civilian communications across more than 100 countries. This is not escalation from strength. This is escalation from the complete absence of any viable alternative. The historical blueprint for what Russia is experiencing in May 2026 is neither complex nor hidden. Every military power that has imploded internally has followed this sequence. The fiction of capacity outlasts actual capacity. The center keeps making decisions based on the fiction, and by the time the gap becomes structurally unsustainable, the resources needed to close it have already been consumed by decisions made on false premises. Gerasimov drew fake villages on a map because honest reporting costs more than the institution can afford to pay. The Duma authorized bank tellers to conduct air defense because the state budget cannot fund real coverage. The court seized Rusegro because a 5.9 trillion ruble deficit before May cannot be bridged through legitimate revenue. And Volodin threatened orbital nuclear strikes against a civilian satellite company because there is no conventional military answer to what Starlink enabled on the Ukrainian front. These are not four separate crises erupting simultaneously by coincidence. They are four outputs of one input. A system that rewarded fiction over truth for so long that it has lost the institutional capacity to respond when reality arrives at full force. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications immediately, because in the next 48 to 72 hours, Russia's September Duma election candidate registration process begins, and the names on those lists, and the names quietly kept off them, will tell you exactly how much confidence the Kremlin still has in a narrative it can no longer sustain on any front simultaneously. The man Gerasimov briefed on April 9th with fabricated coordinates is still directing this war based on villages Russia does not hold, on a budget that collapsed before spring ended, on a timeline built entirely from fiction. The 93.5% collapse is not a data point, it is the verdict. And the map that tried to erase it is now the most important document this war has produced.